PhD student at the Department of Medieval Studies at Central European University and a co-organizer of this conference. Welcome to our first session titled The Digital Middle Ages and Internet Culture. We have 4 panelists, so it will be quite an intensive panel. Each of you will have 20 minutes for your presentations, and after that we will move to the Q&A question part. Without further ado, I want to introduce to you our first presenter, Gaia de Palma. Gaia graduated in art history from the University of Siena in 2019, and she recently attained her postgraduate degree in a 2-year international master in arts, museology, and curatorship from the University of Bologna. Her final dissertation focused on online representation and interpretation of medieval art, in particular through social media. She will now present the paper titled The Memed Ages, Medieval Art and History Through the Lens of Internet Humor. Gaia, the floor is yours.
Thank you a lot. Good morning to everybody. And first of all, thanks to all the organizing team to have arranged such a wonderful conference and having accepted me. So I will now make a full screen. And okay, so my title is, of course, The Meme Ages. Just a second. Okay, so I think all of you know that in the past decades, memes have appeared as a humorous phenomenon on the internet, and art history also as a niche subject has not been exempted from entering this language. In this presentation, I want to explore the use of memes in relation to medieval artworks, arguing that the distinctive combination of irony and virality has also a valuable educational potential that has been underestimated in the field of artistic historical mediation. The relevance of contemporary forms of humor in a discourse about the mediation of medieval art history can be summarized, reminding ourselves that even memes as social texts that constitute our culture belong to the study of cultural participation. So I'll seize that I'll be the first to talk about the subject today of memes to provide some theoretical background to what memes are at large, very briefly, I promise. Next, I'll briefly narrow it down to exploring art memes to then focus on medieval art memes more consistently, which are the protagonists of this paper. The goal will be to analyze how medieval memes can be a useful asset in educating about medieval art and history, what are their strengths, but also their weak spots. So to begin with, what is a meme? A considerable amount of research has gone into defining what an internet meme is. Meme is a term coined by Richard Dawkins to describe the flow and flux of culture, and was first used as a word in The Selfish Gene in 1976 to define small cultural units that circulate from person to person through copying or imitation. Analogous to genes, in as much they are as deterministic on a social level as genes are biological deterministic over individual traits. One of the major critiques to memetic theory is precisely that it emphasizes biological or cultural determinism above the agency of their social actors, minimizing the importance of human agency in the collective cultural formation. So human intervention is precisely what sets apart Dawkins' meme from those that colonize the net. In fact, the term has made a comeback thanks to the internet and internet users. The compound internet meme is often used by netizens to describe the transmission of items such as jokes, gossip, videos, and website from one person to another via the internet. Indeed, the distinctive characteristic of the meme that the original definition shares with the new digital version is its contagiousness, its ability to spread from computer to computer, from person to person, sometimes at an impressive speed. But internet memes are also characterized by distinctive traits such as intertextuality and moving across large boundaries of agency and copyright. In fact, it has become evident that their creation and circulation does not occur through simple contagion, but thanks to the creative and communitarian will of the user. Going more specifically into art memes, a working definition of an art meme can be a unit of cultural production that incorporates art as part of its content. Now, it is rightful to ask what makes art memes so popular on the internet, and the answer is threefold, as it lies in 3 main characteristics. First of all, incongruity is an underlying theme across all art memes. With incongruity, we mean an inherent paradox that can be registered in multiple aspects. First of all, between ancient art and modern context. But it is also a contrast between the high culture perceived in art and the trivial subject that is at the center of the meme. And a third incongruity is also the one that concerns the contrast between the analog, the artwork that serves as a template, and the meme digital nature. Secondly, the intertextuality that goes on in memes taps into affinity spaces, which are spaces where intertextuality is recognized and appreciated, creating bonds through shared interest, a specific sense of humor, or a specialized knowledge. On one hand, this affinity is registered among those who are already versed in art history and who find an extra layer of satisfaction in recognizing themselves as part of a restricted group of understanding a specific subtext of the art meme. On the other hand, the affinity can also go in the opposite direction. Exactly because the reader is not versed in art history, for example, laughing of a ridiculed version of a masterpiece might generate a feeling of overturning the elitarian connoisseurship. What is remained untouched so far is that the internet meme rely on a series of cultural conventions, knowledges, and in some languages that have been shaped by and belong to the internet folk. These languages are a mashup of pre-existing materials, such as art, in fact, recombined in order to convey a present idea. Therefore, as memes spread, their language evolves with them, since memes are in fact an idiom themselves, and as every language, they require a certain degree of literacy to be understood. The internet meme is a paradigmatic case of a new literacy that incorporates a completely unique blend of technical and social features in comparison to traditional literacies. In Meredith Whitfield, in an exhibition developer at the Field Museum in Chicago in 2018, has elaborated a sort of taxonomy of the literacy required in the art memescape, which divide themselves into meme literacy, which is the understanding of various kinds of templates and of internet speak, which are both gained through the direct experience of several memes within the same category. Then there is pop culture literacy, the knowledge of references within art memes to news, events, politics, or even entertainment. Of course, historical literacy and art literacy. And finally, hybrid literacy, which is the ability to recognize all the components of a meme that combine several references across the literacies listed above. So we talk about a compound meme, if you want. Now, let's tap more precisely into what medieval art memes are. So, mutuating from the previous definition, we can describe medieval art memes as units of cultural production that incorporate medieval craft as part of their content. Among all art memes, those that feature and exploit works of medieval art have reached a distinct popularity in what we call the memescape, recognizing to medieval art a high degree of, again, memeability, and their distinctive trait is that their volume and virality are a sign that they are a key way in which medieval images and ideas can replicate in the internet culture of the 21st century. In particular, I will analyze two main areas of manipulation that have been really revealed to be especially fruitful in the provision of templates: medieval manuscripts marginalia and the Bayeux tapestry. So during the Middle Ages, the term marginal is above all referred to the written page. Hence, the term marginalia normally identifies illustrations or notations in the margins of the manuscripts, as you all know, I think. What I would like to focus on here, though, is in particular the group of illuminated marginalia that have become among the favorite targets of medieval memes. Being memes largely a tool to amuse internet users, it comes as no surprise that in the field of medieval art, they picked on the oddest and most grotesque aspect of this imaginary, which is abundant in the marginal spaces of European manuscripts. In this context, lingering on the marginalia's grotesque aspect is constructive to understand the success of medieval decorative illumination in the variegated field of internet humor. Certainly, the sudden discovery of a comical image dating several centuries old drastically clashes with the high tone perception the general public has of history and of medieval history in particular, inevitably generating a hilarious outcome. The paradoxical clash between a format, the illumination, and that comes with the expectation of a high culture historical exhibit, and the content that can be unimaginably obscene, fits the so-called incongruity, as mentioned above. Additionally, though, there might be also an inherently aesthetic aspect in this fantastical illumination that fascinates us and tickle our sense of humor, which is the grotesque. The grotesque characterizes itself for detaching from immediate comprehension, but also for the suggestion of its worthlessness, which makes this marginalia so versatile and up to comical interpretation. The Christian grotesque, in fact, moves beyond decoration towards dialogic meaning, and in this process, comedy intrudes into the grotesque, so that realism and fantasy can mix playfully. The large popularity that medieval marginalia memes have online did not go unnoticed, even by some cultural institutions. It is the case of the KB, the National Library of the Netherlands, which decided to undertake the creation of a website entirely devoted to the creation of memes. The website is an online meme generator with which anyone can make a meme very rapidly by choosing a standard meme format, adding a caption, and then saving or sharing their meme. Of course, all templates provided by the platform are cherry-picked from the manuscripts preserved in the KB and shared in high-quality resolutions. The initiative falls within an audience development strategy. The project was born explicitly with the intention of reaching the youngest audience, which usually does not visit the library website, but on the other hand, is usually very updated in a matter of memes and internet humor. What is really remarkable and truly demonstrates an unusual awareness of the meme medium is that, along with supplying medieval illuminations as templates for meme, the meme generator also provides artistic and historical context to the painting, thus fulfilling the mission of serving entertainment and information via context. This service actively bridges the gap between exploiting a funny medieval painting and knowing the history behind it. Not only this turns the meme into an occasion for educating about medieval art, but expanding the user immediate gaze on the artwork means also concurrently expanding the possibilities of exploiting the inherent humor of the picture with knowledge about the context. According to the National Library of the Netherlands website, what proves the success of the generator is how considerably popular it became among users. Up to 2021, 15,000 medieval memes have been made across 129 countries, reaching an audience of around 2 million meme lovers worldwide, as they define them. Online meme generators, going towards our second example, are more linked than one might think, dating back to the early 2000s, and they almost immediately seize the humoristic potential of medieval art. We are talking about medieval tapestry edits, also known as medieval macros, which are a set of image macros based on historical tapestry. The most common, of course, is the Bayeux tapestry, and artworks from the Middle Ages, as well as parodies generated using, again, online generators. Humor is one of the most effective ways in which the medieval is brought to life in popular culture, and is undoubtedly one of the reasons that the Bayeux tapestry series has remained popular for so long. In particular, as mentioned in the case of medieval illuminations, many of the jokes in medieval humor stem from the incongruity of medieval and modern crashing against each other. Incongruity can manifest in several ways within the Bayeux tapestry series. The first example of incongruity within medieval art memes is the contrast between high culture and low culture intertexted preferences. The Bayeux tapestry is in fact a historical artifact that is clearly recognized as a historically significant text. It is housed in a museum named after it, and it is listed in the UNESCO Mémoire du Monde list. By contrast, all memes, almost by rule, show a careless irreverence towards what is the masterpiece by associating it or just opposing it with other low-level forms of contemporary cultural production. The second way this type of meme is made humorous is fake medieval language, as we see in this example. The purpose is not to recreate true medieval language, instead to use a sort of simulacrum created simply by imitating archaic phrases. This corruption of the artwork's prestige through the contamination with low cultural forms is condemned by many through a display of indignation. But what is overlooked is that precisely in the degradation of the original text, the participants find a gratification, and more importantly, the fortune of the artworks relies on its very vulgarization, which reminds us that the use of comedy in current popular medievalism contributes to its enduring popularity. The historic tale construction kit is a meme generator, once again, an e-card generator, more precisely, which was built using Flash by two German students from the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne in 2002 and was released to the general public in 2003. The website quickly became popular on 4chan, where it was used to produce image macros and reaction photos. However, what I would like to underline is that in order to fully appreciate the comedy of the meme produced with the historic tale construction kit, one needs to be familiar with both the Bayeux Tapestry series and the Bayeux Tapestry, the artwork, which would be a motive for encouraging and seeking a deeper knowledge of the artistic artifact. In fact, the readers who understand the image humor will be pleased in two ways. First, because it is actually amusing, and second, because they realize they belong to a small circle of people who enjoy it. The Bayeux Tapestry meme series fulfills all of three Dawkins conditions for ongoing survival and replication, which are linked to the success of this series. The three conditions are longevity, fecundity, and fidelity. The Bayeux Tapestry series has longevity, having already lasted 10 years. In fact, it appears that its cyclical popularity is linked to its longevity, which is also to its suitability to intertextuality. Then we have fecundity, which is linked to two factors. First of all, good primary material that lends itself to circulation and recirculation, and a fertile environment in which that circulation can take place. Finally, most critics believe that fidelity is about replicability, which is the ease with which replication can happen. Obviously, technical affordances have an impact on this component, which is why internet memes proliferate so quickly. Finally, going into what one can do with medieval art memes, why are they important and how can they be beneficial to education? I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of medieval art memes in education, highlighting 4 strengths and 4 weaknesses. First of all, the first advantage is that memes are a great way to popularize medieval art and history in an informal context with a great degree of spreadability. Next, memes are, of course, a versatile tool, able to adapt to the specific context of fruition and also production. They are a straightforward, clear, and effective way to deliver simple information. And lastly, meme literacy is a language that crosses many barriers, such as the cultural level, hence making memes almost universal, able to confer knowledge and literacy themselves, other than require them. I like to stress the underexploited value of memes by suggesting that hardly anything makes art more alive than incorporating it in the current language, than turning it into an agent of communication rather than the object of the discourse. Making relatable content out of art gives it new life by turning it into an active subject of the speech. Through memes, art memes in particular, old pictures and paintings whose meaning may have been partly or completely lost can still continue to narrate stories, certainly very different from their original one, but nonetheless relatable and relevant. Then, of course, this solution does not come without its weaknesses and disadvantages. Starting with the fact that irony can be a delicate mode to use, especially for institutions, since the risk is, for example, to result offensive. Then art memes can also be prejudiced themselves, as the risk is to reinforce rather than cancel misconception around the Middle Ages. Despite being simple and straightforward, as we mentioned, they can also be simplifying of complex concepts and dynamics. And finally, they often carry some bias in themselves due either to past or current cultural hegemonies and disparities. I'd like to tap into the last point a little bit of replicating biases. In fact, on one hand, art memes reassure us of the universality of the human experience, but at the same time, by featuring centuries-old artworks, art memes reproduce biases and hegemonies of the past. It would be idealistic at best to think that modern humor alone, by means of remixing, featuring, and ironizing, can deconstruct structures of power. The templates that art provides to the meme language are the result of structures of power, societal norms, and ideologies that are partially still in operation. For example, memes often repurpose paintings that are inherently misogynistic or racist, captioning with jokes that show perfectly interpret the original subject of the picture, thus perpetuating a strictly heteronormative, misogynistic, and xenophobic rhetoric. Additionally, since European art is still as the standard within ancient art, and its reproduction are therefore the most widespread online, the very characters that are depicted and that speak for us in art memes are mostly white, very often men, almost always able. Consequently, it will be mostly this category of people to produce and to relate with art memes, as it is this category of people, again, the standard audience this type of humor is aimed to. As a result, subjects of color are excluded from representation in these memes overwhelmingly, and art meme space as part of this ecosystem of content do not represent cultural production that directly contradicts historic or contemporary power structures. In the perspective of cultural mediation, the context might not seem promising. Not only the reader generally does not question the reason why, for example, a marginalia appears amusing, but it's even more difficult to bring attention to medieval history for at least a reason. First of all, the joke would be less funny, with the historian's voice spoiling it. And secondly, chuckling at an apparently nonsense situation belonging to an era already so misunderstood and belittled does nothing but reinforcing the stereotypes upon it. A couple of solutions one can use is the first of all, what I call meta art memes, which are art memes that exploit pre-existing meme structures to explain the art piece that serves as the template. In so doing, they exploit existing literacies, such as meme literacies, in order to confer another, such as art historical literacy. For example, here we see an example of a medieval tapestry edit used to explain in a single meme the major event that concerns the medieval tapestry, the Bayeux tapestry, the passage from the reign of King Harold to the one of William the Conqueror. And to do so, it employs the well-known template distracted boyfriend that we see above, so leveraging meme literacy in order to confer on historical literacy. Secondly, far from wanting to take away the fun from a joke, providing a context for the images that are used for internet memes can be beneficial to the popularization of medieval art for, again, two factors at least. In the first place, showing the causes that led up to obscure iconography helps to withdraw the stereotype of a foolish and degenerate era, hence arousing sympathy by demonstrating the consistency of human purposes through history and how often they are more understandable and relatable than we can imagine. The second reason is, of course, that approaching a new piece of information with an amused attitude can be beneficial to its acquisition and its retaining. In conclusion, and here I conclude, our memes are an underestimated asset in the interpretation of medieval art history, for they can work beyond the niche of those who already possess art and history literacy. In fact, by relying on the widespread knowledge of meme structures and exploiting their internal logic as means of a metaphor, our memes can be leveraged to confer our knowledge rather than require them. Their aptitude to virality makes them an ideal means of coming in contact with those audiences that are generally uninterested in art and history, and similarly, their inherent humor makes them appealing to wide audiences, again, that are not versed in art and history. So here I conclude, sorry if I took a bit too much, and here I conclude my paper. Thank you very much.
Yeah. For your academic and very insightful take on this popular medium. Now we will listen to Olga Makridina. Olga is a research assistant in the Center for Medieval Studies in National Research University, Higher School of Economics in Moscow, Russia. The paper she's introducing during the conference is a part of her research concerned with the question of knowledge about the Middle Ages in the Russian language segment of social media. Olga, please.
So is everything working? Do you see my presentation? Yeah, so thank you. Yes. Good day, everyone. So I want to present my paper, which is called From Memes to Books, the public group suffering Middle Ages as a mediator between academic community and public. So over the past decade, a rapid increase in interest in Middle Ages in Russian language segment of the social media has occurred. So there are a lot of reasons for such phenomenon, which are worth further exploring, but this is not the focus of my research. However, it can be said that one of the reasons was the popularity of different popular cultural products, such as, for example, the TV series Game of Thrones, which became very popular among the Russian-speaking audience. So the most significant example of this phenomenon of popularity of the Middle Ages in the Russian language social media is the public group Suffering Middle Ages, which is in Russian called Страдающее Средневековье. And in my paper, I want to apply to this example, so I can say that my work is like a case study. So this public group appeared in 2013 as an initiative of history students at the National Research University Higher School of Economics. And initially it had an exclusively entertainment purpose, and moreover was not intended to have a wide reach among the audience. It was made just for the local student community which existed in this university. So the basis of the content of the Saffron Middle Ages were fragments of original medieval works of visual art, such as miniatures, marginalias, mosaics, frescoes, etc. To those pictures, various inscriptions were added to make the image speak, turning it into a joke, often into a political satire. You can see the examples of memes from this group with the translation on this slide. So it is important to know that sometime after, however, the creators of the group shifted away from using only medieval visual art. So this format was not a new invention of Russian-speaking internet users. Similar memes had already existed before, like the English language public group Discarding Images, which was created in 2012, and so on. However, this format of groups on historical topics was not common in the Russian-speaking environment. So at first, as I've said, the group was local in nature, but it became popular in 2014, and for now it has over 500,000 followers on the platform Wiki. However, the popularity of this project made it possible for it to take a step outside of the internet and its specific memes culture. In 2018, they have published their first book, The Saffron Middle Ages, The Paradoxes of Christian Iconography. After that, the creators have received a proposal from publishing house to establish a book series. So nowadays, Saffron Middle Ages is not only an internet public group, but a big transmedia project. It is also a series of academic books and an academic podcast. And also there is an educational course on the platform Skillbox. Moreover, just a couple of days ago, they've created a museum of the Saffron Middle Ages. That's how they've called a site about their project. And the purpose of the site was to not only accumulate the information about the project, but also to show some educational material. However, the museum was not opened fully, which became a way to express the political protest. So it is written that some part of the exposition is temporarily closed due to the war. However, in this way, we can see from the example of the Saffron Middle Ages how the project, which initially had a pure entertainment focus, became more than just like this. It is increasingly building a connection with the academic community, and in many ways, this is the example I have drawn my attention to, because since the book series was established, close links have been forged between the academic community and this public group. So I want to investigate the role of the Saffron Middle Ages in the process of communication between academic community and its audience. In order to do so, I took over 30 interviews with medievalists from different institutions. Also, I've interviewed the creators of this group, Saffron Middle Ages, and moreover, I've conducted the audience survey spread through the internet, and last but not least, I took a look at the public group itself and its materials. So while taking the interviews, I've asked respondents about their opinion on the impact of Saffron Middle Ages, which it has on academic community. Interviews with medievalists working in different academic institutions demonstrated that from their point of view, the public group provided new, fast, and effective feedback mechanism which can help to understand what requests the audience has and adjust their public works to such request. I have to look closer at this phenomenon, so it should be noted that one of the problems of communication with the audience or public, both in social media or in any public speech that respondents pointed out, was a lack of understanding of the audience and its demand. For example, Svetlana Jacek, speaking about public speeches, noted that usually medievalists, while doing such speeches, are trying to deconstruct some myths or stereotypes about Middle Ages. However, she pointed out that we do not really know what myths exist in the minds of our listeners, and what we polemicize with, in general, existing only in our imagination. So speaking of communicating with the audience, it is important to know that the situation for the creators of popular internet groups about the Middle Ages in the Russian language new social media is slightly different. Such people are in somewhat different situations than medievalists who run their own personal pages on various platforms. So one could say that the creators find themselves on the borderline between the academic community and the audience or public outside of that academic community. This is especially true when the groups are more of a popular scientific or infotainment groups than a pure entertainment one. Also, the crucial aspect is if the creators of those groups are more or less active in communicating with their followers. Talking about this borderline position, it's worth noting that even though both of the creators of Suffering Middle Ages have a degree in history, nowadays they're working outside of the academia. So when it comes to understanding of the audience demand, it is worth noting that the creators of the public groups about the Middle Ages in social media are in slightly different situation, as I've said. Firstly, they are in a constant dialogue with the followers. This dialogue can be both direct through comments or indirect through feedback, through likes, reposts, the number of comments, and so on. This kind of feedback system provided by social media makes it possible to better understand the audience, its demand, and their response to certain topics. It is important to know that this mechanism is widely used by the creators of Suffering Middle Ages. For example, the editorial board of the book series obviously includes both the creators of the group and the medievalists from academic community. And while choosing the books for the series, the editorial board is taking into account the experience of communication with followers through commentaries, likes, etc. So during my speech, I use such words as the audience and the public, and I want to problematize this question. So it is worth noting that a design of social media platforms gives people the possibility to suggest their own content. The creators of the groups may not take advantage of this opportunity. For example, I've also conducted the interview with the creators of other popular public groups, such as Mothers, Medievalists, or Iconographical Mayhem. So those groups are more educational, or it can be said popular scientific than purely entertainment. Those interviews showed that the creators publish only their own original content. However, some take advantage of this possibility of suggestion of the content. The creators of the Suffering Middle Ages are among this number. It is crucial that nowadays most of the content in this group is generated by its subscribers or followers. Thus, while looking at these kinds of public groups, where some part of the content is created by followers, it is necessary, as I think, to refer to the concept of the participatory culture. So this term was suggested by Henry Jenkins in the field of cultural studies, but is now used in other disciplinary fields as well, especially in media studies. The participatory culture has been put forward as an opposition to the consumer culture. So people in this situation are not only consumers of the product, but also participants in its creation. So going back to the creators of the public groups who publish the content generated by the followers. Those creators communicate with the audience also through the content they offer. They see which topics resonate, and more importantly, they see how readers perceive the Middle Ages. In this situation, observation of the content from the group can also give an understanding of the characteristics of the audience, its demand, and so on. And moreover, we can learn from it which image of the Middle Ages the audience or public have. Going back to the terms of audience and public, I want to state that while talking about Suffering Middle Ages, it is possible to talk not about audience, which is a passive group of consumers, but about public, an active group of people who participate in the production of the content and who has an influence on other aspects of public groups' activity, such as publication of the books and the creation of a podcast. In this case, the public the public has an influence on academic community and products which are created by its representatives. However, some part of the academic community is a little bit concerned with those processes, such as the participation of a public. The significant part of the interviewees is concerned about the possible negative consequences of the influence of the internet culture in general, such as simplification of information, stereotypization of it, etc. The book series of Suffering Middle Ages includes serious academic books on topics which are not connected to the content of the public group almost at all, not talking about the Middle Ages as general theme. However, it also includes books on some funny and humorous theme. Some part of academic community is concerned that because of it, the image of the Middle Ages is changing. The Middle Ages might be seen as something funny and unserious and so on. Also, the representatives of academic community are concerned with the effect of the educational function of the group. So talking about this, I want to apply to the results of the internet survey I've conducted. It can be said that to some extent, the fear about the change of the image of the Middle Ages was not completely groundless. So the audience survey had a question about associations with the Middle Ages, and some part of the respondents, even though not the majority of them, wrote such things as funny, jokes, memes, etc. Also, there was a question about how did the public groups change those associations, and it should be noted that there was a number of answers like every medieval picture now seems as meme and so on. However, the audience survey showed that academical books and podcasts, because of their connection with the entertainment group, caught the attention even of those people who had little interest in history before they discovered this group, and those groups helped them to broaden their knowledge. Moreover, even for those who did not read the books or listen to the podcast, Suffering Middle Ages helped to broaden their knowledge, at least in the field of visual image of this epoch. To some extent, because of this, the public lectures, popular scientific articles connected to the topic of medieval visual culture and to the medieval culture in general attracted more interest than before. Moreover, it is worth noting that the popularity of the Suffering Middle Ages became one of the causes for opening a MA program in medieval studies in Higher School of Economics. It was pointed out in the interview with the academic supervisor of this program. Also, it is worth noting that some followers of the public group stated in the survey that their interest in the Suffering Middle Ages made them thought about studying the history of the Middle Ages in the university. And one person even wrote that they have already entered the medieval studies program in university, even though they did not have any intent to do it just a few years ago. So talking about this educational, if I can say so, potential of the Suffering Middle Ages, I want to apply to one interesting example from the interview. So one of the respondents, Irina Mastyayeva, told me about her experience while doing a seminar for non-historians. She wanted to build a dialogue with new unknown audience and at the same time show a problem with the attribution of different medieval images. This picture, which you can see on the slide, is from medieval Russian manuscript, and it portrays a hare, and actually it is written on the picture, but Irina Mastyayeva have hidden the text. So her purpose was to show as I said, her purpose was to show the problem with the attribution, to show that the medieval portrayal of the animals and everything else could be very far from what we know today, what we imagine today. However, most of the audience have immediately said that the animal portrayed by the picture is the hare, because they have known that picture from the Suffering Middle Ages. And this is not the only example, even though that most common purpose of using the memes in educational process was to cause the attraction. But some people, they emphasize that they tried to use it for educational purposes. So from my point of view, it demonstrates the possible educational potential of this group and of the memes they show. Just by watching memes or doing something entertaining, people are getting acquainted with the visual medieval culture. So going to a short conclusion, I want to highlight a number of aspects. Firstly, Suffering Middle Ages provides a new mechanism of communication between academic community and public, which was almost unknown to the academic community in Russia before. Thus, Suffering Middle Ages becoming a mediator between academic community and its public. Also, the public group, as the audience survey has shown, was one of the reasons for the growth of the interest in the history and culture of this period. in academical works in this about this period. Also, I think that the crucial aspect is that the auditory or followers of suffering Middle Ages, by suggesting their own content to the group and participating in the discussions, is becoming public, passive group of people, not passive. In this case, it can also be said that they're participating in the process of the formation of the image of the Middle Ages in Russian language, new social media. So that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olga, for this very interesting case study. We will now move to Paul Csillag. Paul studied history and European ethnology at universities in Innsbruck, Toulouse, and Istanbul. He achieved a master's degree in both fields with works on the reception of history in pop cultural fiction. Currently, he is working on concepts of the Mediterranean as portrayed in 19th century historical novels at the European University Institute in Florence. Paul, please.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm afraid I don't have such great memes in my presentation, but I hope it will be worthwhile nonetheless. So my topic is rather about authenticity and YouTube, and there will be some parallels to the keynote we have heard before. So, Vikings, everyone knows them, everyone has heard of them. From the original sources to later medieval legends, to novels of the 19th century, the figure of the Viking grew in popularity over the centuries. By now, they are a common trope in historical fiction, ready to be exploited in literature, movies, computer games, board games, etc. Their character as a bearded, axe-swinging, pillaging barbarian became a commonplace in intersubjective knowledge of a 21st century audience. Especially TV shows participate in the increasing hype around these medieval pirates. From the successful show The Last Kingdom to the recent film The Northman, moving pictures have gathered a large fan base infatuated with raids on early medieval monasteries and Nordic benders. One show amongst them, probably the most successful one so far, has acquired special attention. In 2013, Michael Hurst created a new series wherein the audience follows the adventures of famous Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons. They conquer England, sack Paris, raid the Mediterranean, discover Iceland, and fight Russian invasions, all while pursuing court intrigues and an eventful love life. Two elementary parts of every historical show, so it appears. The show lasted for 6 seasons until 2020, and then showed broad popularity amongst millions of people all over the globe. Also, the internet platform YouTube has evolved into an essential part of many people's lives, providing the possibility to post videos, to comment and evaluate. The digital forum can be used for various practices. Companies advertise their products, people give advice to each other, listen to music, entertain, and share political opinions. The usage of YouTube has become so broad that public, both political and historical discourse by now is nearly unthinkable without it, considering that millions of people use it on a daily basis to communicate their opinions. This is also the case when consuming and discussing TV shows and historical fiction like Vikings. Ever since the show was announced, people evaluated its content on YouTube, shared videos and comments. Various fans began to post related clips, which they themselves had produced. Musicians played the soundtrack of the show, boosting their own popularity by attaching themselves to the hype. Others generated educational videos explaining the putatively true history behind the Vikings. In the comments section, however, consumers had the opportunity to express their opinion of the show, both in a positive or negative way. The audience discussed how much they liked or hated Vikings and why. References were made to the talent of directors, screenwriters, and producers, exclaiming their prowess in crafting an ingenious storyline with amazing special effects. Additionally, actors were extolled for their ability to bring long-gone historical figures back to life. Lastly, viewers argued about how authentically the show reenacted historical reality, how close the producers came to reifying what really had happened in the 9th century. I see authenticity, in reference to Alessandro Ferrara's concept of reflective authenticity, as an illocutionary act. Authenticity is a quality that is bestowed onto someone or something by a certain institution or an individual who thinks this entity to be true, hence authentic. Authenticity then is not a quality inherent to the singular entity. It can only be created by an active, reflective agent in a public discourse. Cultural, symbolic, and consequently economic capital is intrinsically connected to the notion of authenticity. An artist, for example, considered as original, expressive, and creative, hence authentic, will, at least in theory, have more success. A politician, adhering to his word, again in theory, proposes a more viable candidate than one who does not. A show that is thought of to be historically authentic has a greater chance at attracting a broad fan base amongst history lovers. In popular discourse, circling historical authenticity, one of the main institutions who authenticates is the audience. Film producers, historians, and other media partake in the discussion around the historical authenticity of a story as established institutions, but the last word often belongs to the audience, the people eventually confirming a movie's or show's relevancy. YouTube provides an opportunity for those fans to communicate with each other and share their opinions on how authentic a show like Vikings really is. By doing so, they essentially decide over the fate of the show, if it will be continued as a successful tale or abolished as an unauthentic, unbelievable story. The internet, with YouTube as one of its strongest representations, facilitated this global and interconnected discourse, which would have otherwise been limited to localized groups. Discussing historical fiction and TV shows in the 20th century had been very different from what it is today. Ideas on authenticity and its definition, however, are as diverse as the audience of Vikings. It is hence immensely difficult to summarize YouTube's digital discourse in 20 minutes, if not even impossible. Having said this, it can be stated that users usually argue on two different levels. On the one hand, fans debate from a personal, mythical perspective. Comments claim to own an authentic connection to either the show, its history, or both because of religious, emotional, or genealogical reasons. People might assert that they know what it means to be a Viking because of their Scandinavian ethnicity or because they feel an inner spiritual connection. On the other hand, viewers discuss in a more, at least ostensibly so, objective scientific manner. They avail themselves of arguments taken from documentaries and textbooks. Their claim to authenticity ought to be sustained by factuality, referring to historical dates, sources, and even academia. However, although proposing a more objective tone, such argumentations are often equally guided by personal incentives. Generally, it can be stated that personal, mythological, and historical comments considering authenticity appear in a mixed form, where emotional and factual statements complement each other. Authenticity, as such, is then used as a tool in the discourse circling historical fiction like Vikings to make political declarations and disqualify other individuals. If fans disagree with certain comments on YouTube or parts of the show, they will question their authenticity by arguing in a mythological and factual manner. By doing so, fans try to regulate who has a right to call him or herself a Viking, or who has the power to discuss authentic Vikingness. my following analysis, I want to focus on a group of fans whose understanding of Vikings follows a rather traditionalist narrative. Their idea of Vikingness equals a homogeneous form of identity, which is only granted to people who can trace the origins back to early medieval Scandinavia, with a problematic understanding of racial whiteness and Germanicness. Attached to this ethnic identity, with its sharp and yet often so volatile demarcation lines, are heteronormative gender roles imagined as the classical man-woman dichotomy. In the context of Vikings, the men become even manlier and the beards bushier. As familiar this inherent form of medievalism is with its conservative implications might appear to some of us, its appearance on YouTube is characterized by a wide range of varying opinions. It would be a mistake to declare fans who identify with this essentialist idea of ethnic Vikingness as a close group of right-wing sympathizers. To analyze how these viewers perceive Vikingness and authenticity, I want to focus on how they discuss gender in relation to the show. A key pleasure for many fans in their identification with strong male roles, as the sword-swinging bearded pirates are often imagined, user HBN demonstrates this association in a rather humorous way when he says that he became a conquering Viking on his way to get eggs from the neighbors just because of listening to the soundtrack of the show. Altiori, on the other hand, another user, asserts his sensation of epicness, a word repeated over and over in the comment section. Epic in this context acquires the meaning of heroic, salient, and yes, even authentic. With his comment, Altiori reacts to legendary Björn Ironside, last seen in the show. As Björn opposes an enemy army, Björn, by the way, was the Viking we saw at the beginning of the presentation, he is hit by 3 arrows, but still manages to lead his troops into battle. Consequently, Altiori is impressed by the heroic scene. He fantasizes about Björn sitting in Valhalla with his father Ragnar, both drinking heavily as a just reward for their deeds in war. Both would be great warriors and great men. Altiori attaches martial prowess to the qualification of an accomplished male human being. User John R is equally impressed. He describes his emotions, which had a direct influence on his body, leading to goosebumps, throat ache, and tears. This would be an abnormal sensation, so the commentator, since he was a straight male and 30 years old. It is implied that homosexual individuals, women, or younger people would have been more prone to cry, a weakness or privilege normally denied to real men. But Vikings would be a show where even these cold-hearted fellows could all allow themselves to shed some tears, especially when the scenes and the music are so powerful, just so epic. Male heroes are the symbol of this epicness, hence the mythical authenticity. By attaching themselves to the protagonists via their demonstration of emotions, users conjure a personal connection to this mythical authenticity. The female characters of the show, however, are interpreted in a more ambiguous way. Some extol the show for finally portraying a strong female character. Paul Nevares states that Lagertha, Ragnar's wife and Björn Ironside's mother, would be a true woman. She's loyal, loving, beautiful inside and outside, strong and ambitious. The Viking shield maiden obtains the traditional features of a woman being loving and beautiful, but also is gifted with otherwise considered traditionally male idiosyncrasies like ambition or strength. This idea of the more manly woman of the North stems from narratives of the 19th century. In novels and historiographies, it was stated that Germanic and Viking women were more equal to their male counterparts in comparison to other societies because the hard life of the North required it. They were hence also thought of to be freer and more independent. User Daniel Ragnarsson, a colorful name, observes that Lagerfeld would be a strong female character Hollywood should stage more often. People generally agree, considering the 1,751 likes, but another fan adds that Lagerfeld was a real person and not a written character. As a direct response, Notorious Big 3K says that at least the historical Vikings were able to portray strong females in opposition to what he or she calls pony princess, and now please excuse my language, shit these days, to please Mickey Mouse and China, Tencent, Copros, and the LGBTQ community. In the form of a rather bewildering roundhouse kick, the user attacks capitalist companies, China, and the LGBTQ community, although connections between the former and the latter are rather obscure. He or she demonstrates nevertheless a general trend amongst commentators on YouTube, the hatred for diversified casting. Shows and films lately tend to allow more and more actors, like in the computer games, who are declared to be diverse to enter their storylines. Roles formerly filled mostly by straight white men become more and more available to actors who are not identified as such. This new tilt towards diversification was not accepted by all fans, even causing a public outcry amongst many. This new woke, as it is often called, tendency, just lost my line there, is felt to be lecturing and even anachronistic, hence unauthentic. The new narrative is at odds with older versions of the same story, other forms of public history, and even the official version told at school. A discrepancy between what the fans understood as authentic Vikingness and the show's new approach disrupted the pre-existing harmony between medium and consumer. Feeling intimidated by a new intrusion supposedly coming from outside, people who identified themselves as white heterosexual male Vikings rebelled against this recent fad. The fear became a phobia, reacting allergically to any change of characters and authorial creativity. Diversification soon became synonymous to the betrayal of the traditional authentic Viking lore, understood to be one's own history, stolen by corporations, China, and the LGBTQ community. User Patrick Nyland subsumes this felt betrayal in 2 sentences. Why do these shows constantly try to force unrealistic women warriors on the audience? I never understand why correct period pieces do this all the time. According to this narrative, female heroes in Vikings are historically unauthentic, while male warriors are accepted as mythologically and historically authentic. To conclude, conservative viewers share proclivity to use authentication as a tool to defend their idea of historical correctness. By referring traditional narratives that were established before the show Vikings existed, by referring to traditional narratives that were established before the show existed, they tried to mobilize a sensation of factuality against, for example, a more diversified cast. Ironically, many other anachronistic mistakes, like wrong costumes, are overlooked or benevolently accepted. This selective criticism of historical authenticity of the show's historical correctness pinpoints to the motivation laying underneath the feigned factuality. Although users attack a diversified casting as anachronistic, factually wrong, and unauthentic, their motivation to do so lays in their own identity as a white heterosexual male. Users criticize the show's creative changes because the new narrative contradicts their own version of history, and lastly, of themselves. My analysis of the personal motivation behind some of the comments does not aim at contradicting their arguments considering factuality. It should rather serve a better understanding of their point of view and the mechanics of digital discourse on YouTube. YouTube has given fans a voice to react to the show and other opinions, and equally to attack them. This digital infrastructure is a necessity to criticize and exchange knowledge on history and to reconnotate it with actual meaning for the current discourse. However, the frame of YouTube as an open to all webpage equally facilitates an increasing mending of historical factual and personal mythological articulations of authenticity, with an unclear distinction between the two. The way how historical authenticity and thus political opinions on current events are created turns increasingly fuzzy. To unravel these underlying connotations, the discipline of digital humanities needs to analyze the everyday digital discourse. Herein lays the chance to orientate oneself better in the broad field of historical fiction and its public reception, and to comprehend their and our definition of authenticity. Authenticity, in contrast to its definition, is always unaccomplished, human-made, and fluid. To acknowledge this is to acknowledge one's own power to co-create it. And I think and hope that that's what we will do at this conference. And with these last words, I thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Paul. And our last presenter today is Jordan Voltz. Jordan graduated with an MA in medieval history from CU and a BA in English from University of Sound. In his research, he focuses on medievalism, and he's currently researching depictions of the Middle Ages in video games from the US and Japan. During our conference last year, he presented a paper on the medievalism of the 1980s Dungeons and Dragons Satanic Panic. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Sorry, when you do the screen share, everything kind of moves all over the place. Hi there. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Jordan. I'm going, as you, my title has changed a little bit, kind of like the last presentation. I decided to pick a quote from my paper and put it in the title. I also want to thank the organizers of the conference for making some modifications so that I could go today. I really appreciate it. I have a flight that I need to catch tomorrow, so I'm very grateful. Okay, so I'm just gonna get into it. Hiroki Azuma's landmark book, Otaku, Japan's Database Animals, has been immensely impactful in the field of Japanese media studies, but it is yet to be applied to the field of medievalism studies. The inspiration for this paper is derived from Andrew Elliott's presentation at Central European University's 2021 Conference on Digital Medievalism, in which he suggested that medievalism should be understood from a media consumer's perspective, and that this memory of the Middle Ages exists, quote unquote, between the screens of these consumers. Elliott's suggestion was that popular media plays a primary role in the consumer's formation of an idea of the Middle Ages, in which the repetition of representations of the era informs a popular understanding of the period. At the same 2021 conference, I presented a paper about medievalism in the Dungeons and Dragons Satanic Panic, and I suggested that representations of the medieval were narratively structured by the post-medieval literary tradition of the Gothic, and that Gothic narrative functors played an important role in aestheticizing the panic. These medievalisms found a home in both mass media and Christian specialty media, where they drew from and reinforced historically derived meta-narratives of the Middle Ages. This paper aims to provide a theoretical grounding for the paper which I presented at that conference, in addition to providing a broader theory for public medievalism, which, according to Paul Strutevant, provides for, quote, the historical consciousness of the medieval world that is the origin of instances of medievalism, end quote. The intent is to draw from Azuma's work in order to sketch the virtual realm from which representations of the Middle Ages are derived and to explain a feature of its organization. In Otaku, Japan's Database Warriors, media critic Hiroki Azuma utilized the concept of the database to explain the selective proliferation of certain elements of popular culture with regards to fan engagement and information technology. The subject of Azuma's book is the otaku, a term used in Japanese fan communities to refer to a hyper-consumer of fictional media who lacks a solid grasp on the external world. The term itself means one's house, and it is the internal and private space where the otaku is suggested to be shut in. One of the more notable aspects of the otaku is that they are members of communities composed by others with similar interests. In these communities, the information which they acquire from media has a greater social value for them than information about reality, leading them to prioritize its acquisition. Information becomes a source for social adhesion, and despite its fictionality, it becomes a real component in the life of the otaku. It should be noted that Azuma does not limit the potential of the otaku to Japan, but insists that as media consumption grows and dominates the sociality of its consumers, we will all become otaku. In this statement, we should not understand Azuma as saying that we will all become this particular cultural historical figure of the otaku, but rather, as digital media proliferates and continues to mediate between us and the real, we are undoubtedly interpolated or addressed as a subject in narratives of both the past and the present, which inescapably contain elements of fictionality. We are constantly addressed in the present as the subject of a historical narrative. And although we may consider ourselves keen enough to divorce the narrative from history, we are still subjected to these narratives. Azuma's ontology of media is deeply indebted to the ontology of the market. An element of a piece of media which becomes popular is copied throughout multiple derivative media, operating as both an homage to the source media, but also as the representation of an idea. This representation becomes categorized alongside other elements, and future media draw upon it as an idea with existing cultural value that their audience recognizes. At this stage, Azuma considers this media to be produced from a database, and as the consumer consumes this media, they are also consuming the database, the storage house from which the ideas of the media were derived. This database is both literal and figurative, referencing the ability for the consumer to categorize and search database elements through information technology, in addition to a method of comprehending similar elements within a vast amount of media and sketching the method through which database elements reproduce. This database is explained as, quote, the grand non-narrative, end quote, a structure of information from which media is derived, and the consumption of this database grants the media consumer a deeper insight into the fundamental elements of the media from which their derivatives are produced. In this way, the consumer understands the source from which derivative media is produced. Azuma further argues, citing Jean-Francois Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, that the consumption of the non-narrative database replaces the function of meta-narratives in the consumer's historical consciousness due to the social function that the consumption of the database provides. Meta-narratives are understood here as grand narratives which position the past, present, and future in a singular narrative in order to provide an explanatory function to the present. In line with Descartes' writings on periodization, in these meta-narratives, periodizations perform a concrete narrative function, and thus we can talk about the meta-narrative function of a periodization like the Middle Ages. Within European historiography, it could be argued that the Middle Ages have always had a dichotomous meta-narrative function, as the golden age of the birth of nations or as a dark age. I will argue that, contrary to Azuma, meta-narratives are very well alive in the historical imaginary and actually structure the representation of elements in medievalist media. Echoing the works of Jacques Derrida and Mark Fisher, these medieval meta-narratives have the agency of the virtual, in that they haunt or predetermine the structural elements of medievalist media and thus shape the public perception of the medieval. As I mentioned previously, the paper which I presented at the previous conference illustrated this. Lyotard's famous quote, I define the postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives, is often cited, but it is rarely correctly understood within its context. Positioned at the introduction of his book, Lyotard uses it to illustrate the triumph of a scientific understanding of reality. This is particularly the case within academia, a social institution whose legitimacy is predicated upon their ability to utilize science in order to validate knowledge. For Lyotard, science is in constant tension with the explanatory function of narrative, which, quote, judged by the yardstick of science, the majority of them proved to be fables, end quote. The reconciliation of science and narrative is found in the meta-narrative, the hallmark of modernity, which, quote, produces a discourse of legitimation with respect to its own status, such as the dialectics of the spirit, the hermeneutics of meaning, the emancipation of the working or rational subject, or the creation of wealth, end quote. In contrast, the postmodern incredulity towards these meta-narratives is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, end quote, and is marked by a skepticism towards both the metaphysics which structure these meta-narratives and the university institutions which are legitimated by them. As a result, quote, the narrative function is losing its functors or tools of narrative explication, its great hero, its great dangers, its great goal, end quote. Science then operates as a language game which can only legitimate itself, and thus history can exist untethered to any broader narrative about it. In short, the narrative function of meta-narratives is no longer seen as scientific as a result of scientific progress in the institutions which had previously validated them, and this produces skepticism towards the validity of these meta-narratives. There's much to comment on here, but most importantly, we should note that the incredulous subject of Lyotard is the academic and not the public. The editor of Azima's English language translation is quick to point this out. However, at the risk of instantiating a public academic binary, the author suggests that the belief in a meta-narrative is not required for its representation in a piece of media about history. Moreover, meta-narrative itself becomes a critical aspect of the history database and appropriately sorts and determines which historical elements will be represented and how they will be situated within the narrative. The result is that meta-narratives haunt, predetermining the future representations of history in media. This paper will discuss the two most prominent meta-narrative functions of the Middle Ages which have appeared in media, the Romantic and the Gothic. However, it is worth dwelling upon the ironic reproduction of meta-narrative elements, especially in response to the supposed incredulity of the audience towards meta-narratives. In medievalist films like Shrek, an ironic recognition of a meta-narrative as an outdated historical trope still provides an affirmation of the meta-narrative alongside its continued reproduction. Shrek's ironic use of the medieval romantic narrative deserves further discussion. One of Shrek's most memorable songs, I'm a Believer, begins with the line, I thought love was only true in fairy tales, meant for someone else, but not for me. And this underlines the ironic distance which Shrek and the audience share with the traditional romantic narrative. It suggests the audience's shared understanding of both the fictionality of romantic narratives and Shrek's numerous inversions of the romantic database, and Shrek's numerous inversions of romantic database elements. The knight is an ogre, the steed is a donkey, etc. Even though, and perhaps because it recognizes its database elements with irony, it thoroughly executes the narrative functors of the medieval romance, as will be discussed later. As evidenced by the longevity of Shrek in meme culture and in fan projects like Shrek Retold, Shrek demonstrates that the medieval romance, even though or because it is defined by its ironic presentation, still functions as a narrative with cultural validity. It enables us to recognize the romantic meta-narrative as defunct, while reproducing it and confirming its hallowed position as an organizing function of the database. The Middle Ages, as a period which was situated from its inception within a meta-narrative, is well suited to an analysis of meta-narratives in their media representation. David Matthews in Medievalism, A Critical History identifies two primary narrative functions which the medieval serves within meta-narratives, the Romantic and the Gothic. Within the context of this paper, I will discuss how these are briefly deployed. I will discuss how these meta-narrative functions of the medieval are deployed in medievalist narratives. These narrative functions are remarkable because they demonstrate the legacy of the medieval through its meta-narratives and highlight the repetition of elements which compose and structure the medieval database. The Gothic is the heir to the Renaissance tradition of the medieval, an update to Enlightenment sensibilities of history, which, quote, entailing the assumption that anything medieval will involve threat, violence, and warped sexuality. Conversely, and somewhat self-fulfillingly, this view assumes that where the threat of sexual violence is made, something medieval is going on, end quote. Matthew's final point is especially relevant, as indicated by Bruce Holsinger's neo-medievalism, neoconservatism, and the War on Terror. Holsinger's text describes the use of the Middle Ages as a tool for legitimating the War on Terror, and he argues that President Bush's portrayal of medieval violence functions to deny the coevality of his opponent and thus legitimates his government's intention to replace the so-called barbaric and anachronistic governments with a rational and modern one, i.e. Bush's crusade. Likewise, the Gothic is also a literary tradition which exposes the fetishism of scientific progressivist thought by indicating its limits, often through madness or the supernatural. Primary database elements within the European Gothic database, dark castles, stormy nights, thick forests, found its root as a form of Enlightenment historical imagination of the Middle Ages in Horace Walpole's 1794, The Castle of Otranto. Widely considered the first Gothic novel, Otranto was presented by Walpole as a previously undiscovered manuscript written in 1529, in which a lord attempts to marry his daughter before he is violently punished by God. Walpole's preface begins, The principal incidents are such as were believed in the darkest ages of Christianity, but the language and conduct have nothing that favors of barbarism. If the story was written near the time when it was supposed to have happened, it must have been between 1095, the era of the First Crusade, and 1243, the date of the last, end quote. The most recent development in the Gothic meta-narrative can be referred to as the real, evidenced best by trends of representation inspired by Game of Thrones. As Riccardo Ficini points out in, quote, "I watch it for historic reasons, representation and reception of the Middle Ages in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. This real is a reaction to previously dominant romantic forms of representation, in which the show's sex and violence, amongst other elements, are understood as historically authentic, even though these elements conform more to the meta-narrative than a scientific account of history. They are considered to be real to the extent that they conform to an established and dominant meta-narrative. The Romantic also contains elements of the Gothic, in which the danger of the Gothic is presented as a challenge for the protagonist to overcome. The most familiar form of this narrative has an explicit link with the medieval narrative of the same name, or with medieval narratives of the same name, often serving as a post-medieval refurbishment of the medieval romance genre. As Matthews mentions, violence towards women and the violence of the male protagonist against those seeking to harm the woman are often core narrative elements. In Matthews' analysis, the Gothic and the Romantic often intertwine with each other in medievalist narratives, and this positions violence or suggested violence against women as a core narrative functor in these narratives. Two excellent bachelor's theses have extrapolated on the legacy of the medieval Romantic narrative in contemporary medievalist video games. Gavin Kenneth Edward Davies' Adventure Capitalists, Medieval Quest Narratives in Japanese Role-Playing Games, and B. Epskin Shapson's Essential Narrative Structure of Medieval Romance and Video Games. Shapson provides a structuralist comparison of the narratives of medieval romances in contemporary medievalist games. He arrives at the conclusion that the two employ fundamentally similar database elements, i.e. plot structures and narrative functors. In Shapson's discussion of combating these two media, they utilized Vladimir Prop's theory of narrative functors and folktales in order to compare the rescue of Princess Zelda in Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild with the rescue of Isolde and Tristan and Isolde. Quote, "A condition, the King of Ireland only marrying Isolde to the Slayer of the Dragon prevents access to Isolde. This requires a situation that creates the condition, the dragon's presence in Ireland, and then a desire to acquire what is safeguarded by the condition, Mark's desire for a wife. This reflects the structural sequencing illustrated by Prop's use of functions. The lack of a bride is followed by a desire for a bride, which is followed by a search for a bride, an obstacle to acquiring her, and so on. Prop's functions illustrate the sequences underlying each step in the narrative, creating a structure in multi-cursoral by mandating a logical progression of events. This logic is culturally situated as a narrative expression in the medievalist romance, but it is obvious that this logic does not need to be bound to a specific culture. As Davies evidences in his monograph about Japanese video games, these database elements can travel and it adapts when it travels. Comparing one of the earliest, if not the earliest medievalist video game, Adventure, with Gawain and the Green Knight, Davies describes Adventure as, quote, "a post-medieval interpretation of traditional romance narrative that reformulated the romance tradition into a binary logic composed of enumerated tasks, which set a precedent for subsequent role-playing games to follow suit." He continues to note that through the transition from medieval text to post-medieval game, the symbolic value of the romance genre's original contents are divorced from their historical context and repurposed by video games, beginning with Adventure, when adapting the quest narrative into goal-oriented activity for players. Davies continues to describe the transfer of the role-playing game to Japan, and then argues that Japanese capitalism imprinted itself upon the form of these quest narratives. They argue that the Japanese philosophy of Kaizen is embodied in these games through grinding, where repetitively performing comparatively menial tasks will improve the player's ability to deal with harder battles. This technique is best embodied by early Japanese medievalist games like Hydlide, but similar strategies for dealing with challenges can be found in their American predecessors like Wizardry. Davies argues that this evolved into a managerial strategy for dealing with encounters, where maximizing the benefits of the protagonist's equipment became as necessary an element for victory as grinding. Though this, and noting only one example of Japanese iteration on the medieval database, because there are plenty more, cultural elements of Japanese capitalism have become integral to successfully executing the combat central to the romantic narrative. It is also likewise important to note that these cultural elements have spread alongside the globalization of Japanese video games, evidencing a critical point. Namely, Europe and North America do not have a monopoly on the production of medievalism, nor is this production a simple re-explication of established cultural forms. As a result, any honest analysis of medievalism must either contain a global dimension or be aware of its provinciality. Meta-narratives are alive and well in medievalist media, where they structure the reproduction of narrative elements in these media. The two most frequent meta-narratives of the medieval, the Gothic and the Romantic, have a historical basis which is realized in contemporary media. Contrary to Hiroki, these meta-narratives remain alive in historical consciousness and influence the reproduction of medievalist narratives through historically pre-established narrative functions. The media which expresses these meta-narratives contributes to the medievalist database, enabling shifts and transfers of certain database elements within the database as it conforms to audience perceptions of the Middle Ages. This interplay of audience preference and media consumption forms public medievalism and illustrates the ability for the medieval database elements, for medievalist database elements to change. As a final note, these transfers are important for underscoring the differentiation and proliferation of the medieval within non-European databases, and any history of medievalism should pay attention to transformative encounters of the medieval, both in space and time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you all for your fantastic and very original presentations. Now we will move on to the Q&A part of the session. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand or post your question in the chat if you feel more comfortable this way. And I would like to start the conversation with a question to Gaia and Olga regarding the reception and popularity of those memes. Based on your research and reactions you saw, how do you interpret the reception of memes that tend to replicate biases and stereotypes vis-a-vis those that present the accurate information? Do they tend to land better among the popular audience?
I don't know if I can talk, or maybe Olga may take the lead afterwards. Yes, that's a very interesting question. I wondered that myself, and I think actually that mostly for a matter of, seeking what reinforces our knowledge, probably those memes and those jokes that reinforce the stereotypes and structures of power, all the the misinformation, the misconception around the Middle Ages, but also all the structures of, for example, misogyny and xenophobia might actually, sadly, be the one that have a better success in terms of virality. But of course, this is because also memes themselves at large are born within a field of right-wing extremism. 4chan, of course, in the first times was this basically was a meme maker by the right wing. So sadly, I think I have to admit that those are the ones that have the major spreadability. If we don't want to use the term virality. Of course, it's always hard to learn something new, to change, to rewire our convictions and our interpretation of reality, contemporary or past. So of course, it needs to use memes in education, as I argued, and also it's exactly because people need to go in this direction when they want to hear a joke. They don't want to learn a lesson. So this is the difficulty is in making the joke also a lesson in a way that is not hard to comprehend. So something that is enjoyable and not difficult to understand by everybody, even by those that only want to have their opinion confirmed. This is my personal opinion, but I'm curious to hear about Olga if she has something to say.
So yes, to some extent, I agree with what you said, but I want maybe to say a little bit about the specificity of the memes culture in Russia, because talking about stereotypes, I think it is important that the memes which became viral to some extent because of the suffering Middle Ages, they used such images which were almost unknown to the Russian audience before. So I think in Russia, it is a little bit specific situation because they helped to those memes, they helped to I can say crush some of the stereotypes, because people in the audience survey I've conducted, people wrote that those memes, they not helped to fight with the stereotypes they've had, because they've showed that those those people in the Middle Ages, they were not so that those ages wasn't so dark, that there was a big culture, and also they've shown those memes, they have shown the other side of the people's life back then. So I think that I don't know if in Europe or any other country outside of Russia there is such situation, because maybe in Europe people are most common with the culture of medieval manuscripts and so on. But for Russia, it was something unknown. And in some way, it helped to build another stereotypes, new stereotypes. As I said, that people think now, a lot of people think now that Middle Ages is something funny and so on. But this strange situation with the deconstruction of stereotypes or construction of them is something that I'm exploring for now. So I think that's my answer.
Thank you very much for your answers. And please feel free to ask your questions. Paul.
Well, probably it's not my position to ask a question since I'm also presenter, but I actually have a follow-up question to that, because also I was reminded of that one during Jordan's presentation, that we should not just look at European medievalism. And now in the presentations on the memes, they were mostly on, don't even want to call it European, maybe Christian manuscripts, Christian documents. So I was wondering if Olga and Gaia, you came across memes that dealt with, let's say, images from Japan or from India or Persia or anywhere else, really. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll answer first again. Not so much, not so many, sorry, sadly. And that is a thing, like I use this, this presentation is basically a part of my postgraduate thesis. And this was exactly the disclaimer that I put in the forefront, that I would have analyzed what is the Western Middle Ages, because I think they are also the most widespread in, you know, we live in a Western culture after all, so also the Western past, it becomes the globalized past. And yeah, I was curious actually to find if there were some, you know, Indian manuscript that would have served as a template for memes, or as you said, Japan, but it was really a minority. Of course, they weren't non-existent, but in the big picture, they were a really small part. So I think more deep analysis would do good in this direction, because it's actually a field that is not that popular, but should be. Like, we should, you know, deconstruct the hegemony of the Western past and the Western Middle Ages, because it's all those when we talk about medievalism in general. So yeah, this is also a very interesting point. Thank you.
I can answer that. For me, there are, again, a little example from Arabic culture or Indian culture or so on. But in Saffron Middle Ages, there is a number of memes that made based on the Russian manuscripts. And it is an interesting example because in this case, like Russian manuscripts are closer, let me formulate it. To some extent, the thing that Saffron Middle Ages used both Russian and Western European manuscripts, it became a reason to talk about like Russian Middle Ages, which is a discussed topic, because it is still a discussed topic whether Middle Ages did exist in Russia. So I think that I tried to investigate this question of Russian Middle Ages and memes based on Russian manuscripts, but it is still a work in progress. But my theory is that those memes are helping to broaden the geographical frames of Middle Ages.
Francis, please go on.
I'm unmuted. Can I be heard? Yes. No, I was noticing first Paul was discussing a problem of expanding beyond Europe, the Middle Ages, which is always, I've kind of had a problem with that because the term Middle Ages only has a certain amount of meaning within a, you might say, a mindset, which is also geographical, but it's also historical mindset, which was invented in Europe and more precisely in Western Europe at a given time. There's even actually the term Middle Ages has its own history, which is actually interesting and all that. What I found interesting about your papers, and all of them, I like how they bounce together well, is that they're all talking about something. The term meta was used by Jordan in that, is how they seem to, especially when you're dealing with memes and things like that, you're exploring not so much the Middle Ages, but how not only we look at the Middle Ages, but how we exploit them to look at ourselves. And I found that rather interesting to see in the various ways, because I mean you have also how the Russians look at themselves and their selves like that, adding to that a vision of the Middle Ages and the vision of what the Middle Ages are. By the way, last little point for Jordan, I noticed that he didn't quote the monkeys, which is the actually original where the line comes from. Which is also an interesting little play because you have also another set of a billiard table of references. But that's the problem with Shrek, actually. Is that oh, there you go. That no need to be serious. I like these things. I like the fact that it's not serious. That makes it interesting.
Go on.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Paul. Something that caught my attention from your paper and from your study in the case of Vikings is the contradictory reactions to the same phenomenon, right? As you mentioned, for example, having at the same time liking a lot of characters like Lagertha, but disliking the presence of female women, which again is contradictory in itself. And I was wondering I mean, of course, you focused a lot on the reaction of audiences, but maybe I would like to go a little bit to the product itself, because Vikings in that sense is a particular form of historical show because it's historical, it's like in that blurry line between the historical and the mythological, which again does not apply to all historical productions, right? So what I would like to maybe ask you to go a little bit deeper into is from looking then from the other side, what do you think is Vikings actually maybe trying to say that allows for these type of interpretations, even contradictory within its own production? Maybe it's an issue of how the characters are portrayed. Maybe it's an issue of the very genre that is not fully historical, but is not fully mythological either. So yeah, I would like to know your opinion on that.
You mean how they treat gender or historical authenticity as a whole?
I mean, I think they are somehow related, right? In the end, it's more like, maybe the question could be like, what is maybe Vikings trying to say about this period that allows for this type of very contradictory type of approach into it? When, I mean, as you mentioned, right, in the end, on the one hand, there is this complaint about female warriors, which, I mean, in the end, we don't know. They might have been, the sagas mentioned them, but on the other hand, omitting factual things like props, clothing, etc., etc.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. So just a small remark to the female warriors, because it's really funny, because when you enter these comment sections on YouTube, you have discussions that go for 80 comments, you know, they answer to each other, and the article such and such said there were shield maidens and other articles say no. So it's really interesting what is going on there. But I think in general, the producers of a historical movie or a historical TV show are confronted with many things and many people they want to please. So first of all, they want the movie to be as cheap as possible in production and makeable. But they also want to make it impressive. And I think the same goes for historical authenticity. So first, they want to make it makeable and presentable. So you cannot make it totally authentic. But also they want to have a certain amount of historical authenticity in there, so it appears as some sort of a time travel back to the era or the epoch that is portrayed. And I think when it comes to decisions on the cast, or on should we have a leading female role, that really comes down to the singular showmaker. For example, in Vikings, in the first 6 seasons, I think they kind of went with the small crest in the middle. So that's my take, but I'm sure there are other interpretations from people who have seen the show. So I think they were trying to please, on the one hand, these people I was talking about, who are rather going with the traditional picture of the male white Viking, but they were also trying to diversify the people portrayed. So for example, you had the Vikings going to the Mediterranean, and then you had female Arabic actresses partaking in the storyline, coming from the taifas of Al-Andalus, or you had Asian slave who was for a long time part of the show. And you have exceedingly more and more female warriors. So in the first season, it was just Lagertha, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then it became more and more from season to season. So I think we can actually see the trend rising. And now there's this new show coming up, this follow-up show. Maybe some have heard of it, Valhalla, Viking Valhalla. And yeah, and they went just full blow with it. And there was also a massive backlash towards the decisions on diversification. So it's really an interesting discourse to witness on YouTube. But I hope I somehow answered your question.
Yeah, and if I may, I also have a question for Jordan. I wanted to ask you, because one of the, and this pretty much out of very personal curiosity, because one of the examples that you mentioned about this Japanese appropriation of medieval romance narratives was the case of The Legend of Zelda. Now, I've always found interesting how Zelda, being a fantasy game, depicts this medieval period, considering it is a Japanese production. From the settings, from the narrative, from the way in which it tends sometimes to mix cultural Japanese elements into it. But of course, one of the things that catches my attention a lot in all of this is that Zelda is always present in the title, but you never play as Zelda, and sometimes Zelda is not even present. And yet the game has the same title. She's always like this behind presence in all of this. So it would just really to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on this development about how Zelda compares from a Japanese perspective, this use of this type of medieval narratives, meta narratives that you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. The Japanese title is it's a pretty literal translation, Densetsu no Zelda. But I don't think I have a good answer for why that's the case. But if so one of the things that's really interesting about sort of 80s era Japanese medievalist games that become, first of all, imported to the United States or localized to the United States. And then it's from the United States that they begin to have a wider cultural dispersion, because in many cases, the European versions, and we're talking about the NES here, so we're talking primarily about North American and European versions that are actually given a fully, like a fully official localization. In many of these games, Dragon Quest is a big one. Final Fantasy is a big one. You have, I think I mentioned this in my previous presentation, explicit Christian elements. Like there's an item, I think it's the magic book or something in the first Zelda, and it's called the Bible. I think there's another phrase where a character says God be with you, which was also kind of cut out of the game as it was localized to North America, and of course then beyond there as well. There's a paper that I read that I didn't really know what to do with, but I'm kind of interested in it. There's this sort of post-war cultural marketing / popular phenomenon in Japan called furusato, which is a way of like saying one's hometown. But it's meant to evoke this sort of nostalgia for for the rural, for the countryside. You could say that it has like a very strong romantic kind of quality to it, in the way that we would talk about like the romantic and the medieval, when it comes to the sort of more sublime aspects of nature. And there was a paper that was talking, I think, about Ocarina of Time with regards to furusato as well. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's one of those things where I think you could look at something that has sort of a medieval setting, and then very easily kind of draw similar phenomenon or similar or analogous cultural traditions from it as well, or find ways to express these sort of things using this sort of same set of aesthetics.
I think you mentioned something that is very interesting that I had not thought about, and maybe something that one tends to take out of the picture when one approaches this type of products, and it's like the marketing campaign behind it, right? As you mentioned, when all these franchises were created, they were first and foremost focused on the American market, something that would appeal to the American market, and then taking it outwards to the other countries. Which again, I think is very interesting, because it would be like layers upon layers, that a Japanese company interpreting how the United States might see the Middle Ages in order to create a fantasy game. And I think that's a very, very interesting way of approaching the problem, because sometimes when one sees games like Zelda, one notices elements that maybe are not that obvious when you're just playing it, because you just assume them as part of the narrative. I read this paper that made this very interesting point, that in Zelda, the only race that is quote unquote evil are the dark people of the East, which is where Ganon comes from. It's the only race that has like this kind of evil element to it, which again ends up reproducing a series of medievalist discourses about East and West, Christians and Muslims, etc., etc. So yeah, but thank you for your answer. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that was an interesting response as well. Yeah, you can follow up on this more if you're interested.
Emran, please go on.
I mean, just to follow up on Juan's response, like it made me also think that, I mean, even though first and foremost the idea of Middle Ages is like a product of discussions when it comes to Europe, but we see more and more, especially towards the 19th century, the creation of national histories in non-European geography and emergence of medieval periods of their own through their discussion of periodization as well. And it's interesting to see, despite that, still the quote-unquote Western medieval captures the whole horizon again through the medievalist, language, rather than the if you will, the intra-medieval paths that were created, but has also histories of its own that are, and rather than them being turned into all sorts of genres that we're talking about today. So that I found very interesting, that it reproduces to some extent the predominance of Western medievalism, and magnifying that through creating these time-honored discourses through that medium, rather than the domestic resources, and that invites for further exploration, I believe, when it comes to why this is happening. So, thank you very much.
Jordan, go on.
Yeah, can I follow up on that really quickly? Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that understanding like capital really helps, especially because we're talking about the Middle Ages as a product here. I think that really helps kind of understand the way that sort of both power and narrative flows through a lot of these, not necessarily as in a hegemonic way. We can, of course, and we have seen it throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, post-colonial countries using the Middle Ages as a way of articulating their coevality with Europe. In a way that still exists today. But one sort of a little interesting note, while we're also talking about Japanese video games from the 1980s, is that if you look at live action advertisements and for these games within Japan, you'll see that both Japanese protagonists and the way that, of course, there's sort of this discourse of racialization, which constructs Japanese identity within Japanese media, and white protagonists. They tend to be interchangeable for the most part, with the exception of the protagonist, usually, who is almost always Japanese. But also within Japanese animation, there's this technique called mukokuseki, which means without nationality. And the idea is that this blends the representation of both white and, in this case, sort of a racialized Japanese protagonist into the sort of the same representational paradigm, in that it's sort of indistinguishable. Generally speaking, whether or not the protagonist or whether or not a character is white or if they're Japanese. And this enables sort of for this, you could call it a more inclusive Middle Ages if you want, but I think that it also sort of engages in a discourse of exclusion at the same time.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I really wonder then, okay, this is in a given genre that you explore. And since I think our Twitter group actually made a campaign of historical novels on not just Western medieval idea of Western medieval war, but across the globe. So I wonder whether there's an intercommunication between things that you see and the novels, but that's entirely a project of its own. But since this is part of media studies, so I wonder whether there are any intersection points on that regard, and what the demand is, or are we talking about entirely separate worlds, spheres? There's no, because of the difference of audiences, whether it squares with this quote unquote high and low, cultures. I mean, it really triggers a lot of questions. So fascinating.
If I can follow up to something that everyone is saying, I wanted to build a little bit upon what you were saying, because I think it's also like the media is incredibly important in the middle of all of this, right? And I'm taking, for example, the two papers that we had about memes, because in this case, it's not technically for example, the film time of representation, but it's actually using the material from the time. And in a country like mine, right, I come from Colombia, which I know comes from a Western tradition, but the Middle Ages is really not something for us. We kind of say it in school, but really nobody knows anything about it. And yet when you use this type of memes, I mean, I don't have a big sample about this out of personal experience. They all pretty much recognize the whole meaning behind it, which maybe would bring me to one question, because I'm not an art historian. And what Gaia was saying in her presentation did really catch my attention, and is maybe to go a little bit deeper, like from the perspective of art history. What do we know about the art of this period that lends itself so easily to this type of exercise? Also, if Olga also wants to participate, because of course both of you were working on memes, but yeah, that would be my question.
Yeah, exactly as I explained in the presentation. Probably it depends on the format. For example, if we take marginalia as an example, the grotesque and ironic part of the illustration in itself, like the aesthetic, the inherent aesthetic of the picture, is humoristic because it was intended to be such. So in a way, I think it could be actually universal in a way, in the way it appears as humorous for even people who do not know about the Middle Ages and do not have really an art historical knowledge about the period, about the stylistic aspects, so they are not versed in that field. But it could be anyway very funny, especially because from the aesthetic itself, which is wildly different, with a sensibility that is wildly different from ours. For example, already with a painting from the modern period, so 1600s and 1700s and on, there the realism taps in. So it's more in our taste, let's say. It's more classic. We recognize it more immediately as beautiful, quote unquote, because it represents our standards of beauty, and therefore it cannot really be humorous. Instead, what the medieval aesthetic has is precisely this not being, again, quote unquote, beautiful to our eyes, and therefore it immediately appears as humorous, as comedy, as ironic in itself. And this could be also beyond the knowledge of medieval style, medieval art history. And of course, this could be something that could be leveraged on to confer, again, art historical knowledge at large. For the general public and people who just stroll on the internet and encounter a meme and thinks, okay, this is funny because of the aesthetic that it portrays, and not because of some other structure of knowledge more complicated. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think that yeah, again, we live in a society that's basically shaped by the Western culture worldwide. So of course, probably the same wouldn't be true with, I don't know, with an image that still doesn't represent our aesthetic, like our canon aesthetic, but comes from, I don't know, Africa, India, or some Native American image. Maybe that would work different, but because we, in a kind of subconscious way, probably recognize what is Western culture and what is not, and what is our hegemonic culture we live in and what is not. So that, again, it would be interesting to research more into. I don't know if Olga wants to expand the topic. I think we are some kind of twins in this panel about talking about memes, but
yes, actually, I don't think that I have something to add, but maybe one of the reasons of the popularity of the memes based on manuscripts is also that, well, it was something that was told in the interview, not once, I think like 10 times or something like that, that the thing with medieval manuscripts is also that there is no an effect of, how's it called, of hollow valley, because we can we can like see that those people are people, that they are something we can think that we can be in this situation, but there is no situation of a hollow valley when this satire is too, well, too strange or scary, like something like that.
Well, if there are no more questions for now, I highly encourage you to continue the discussion on Topia. And also, if you have some time to spare, please watch the recordings of the last year's panels and that are available there. I would like to thank our panelists for making this first day of the conference very intellectually stimulating and for setting the bar very high for the upcoming panels. I would like to also invite all of you to join us tomorrow through the same Zoom link as today. The first panel will start at 9 a.m. Central European time, and it is titled Creating and Designing Medieval Digital Experience. Also, follow us on Twitter, as Evren posted in the chat. And see you tomorrow, and thank you for joining us today.